Hey guys, coming at you from Therapy Rocks. Rocks spelled R-O-X, YouTube channel focusing on complex post-traumatic stress disorder or childhood trauma. My name is Kathy Newton, and I'm a therapist in private practice in the heart of the Ozarks in Missouri. Today we're going to just do a brief video on the chemicals involved with emotional flashbacks and spontaneous age regression. And this comes from a book that I recently wrote called The Upset That Comes with Little. It's a handbook for survivors struggling with spontaneous age regression, or something called emotional flashback. Feeling flashback, sometimes people call that. So basically, I just wanted to talk about what happens when you are hyper aroused and what happens when you're hypo aroused. So when you get activated, some people get hyper aroused and some people get hypo aroused. So some people go into a state of mind where they're hyper alert, they're panicky, they're defensive, their tendency to overreact. There's a tendency to feel completely overwhelmed, and that is hyper arousal. Okay? And then sometimes people go into hypo arousal. Okay, and that is where you're passive, you're shut down, you can't say no, you're just completely into that shut down, total submission mode. Sometimes you numb out. And so there are very real chemical responses in your body for each of these, we'll call them action systems, each of these reactions. Okay, each of these are both very dysregulating for trauma survivors. And they really are a dissociative state when you think about it. So what happens when you go into hyperarousal is you have increased heart rate, increased skin conductance, increased blood pressure, decreased serotonin, and there is a huge release of endogenous stress-responsive neurohormones. Okay, so people will talk about when they get activated, especially into that fight place, into that fight action system. People get activated or triggered into that fight mode, and they can just feel the chemicals just course through their body. It's like there's this big, huge dump. And what gets dumped into your system is cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine, vasopressin, oxytocin, and adrenocorticotropin, and other endogenous opioids. Okay, I don't know which endogenous opioids get released with hyperarousal versus hypoarousal, but it was explained to me that hypoarousal, what happens chemically in your body, is the equivalent of 8 milligrams of morphine. Okay, so your body is literally preparing to be injured. It's that freeze state that you see animals in, or that total submission state where you see a predator grab an animal and the animal just goes limp, or the possum just starts to freeze. That is the equivalent. It's an endogenous opioid that your body actually makes that is the equivalent of 8 milligrams of morphine. That just blew my mind. So trauma survivors can actually get addicted to their own neurohormones. And sometimes the hyperarousal, obviously, or the hypoarousal, so fight, flight, freeze, total submission. These are action systems that become hardwired, and they become just default modes for trauma survivors. And so it's not even that anyone thinks about consciously being hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused. It just happens automatically. Okay, and it happens again in a picosecond. And this all goes together with that video on the hostile takeover and why it's so difficult for trauma survivors to control the overreaction or the underreaction, because it is driven, literally driven by the neurohormones in your body. Everything in your system is saying that you're in danger. And we've got to try to create a bypass, okay, for that. for that action system, for that emotional flashback, that process that happens in the body when the body thinks it's in danger, and the primitive part of your brain is running the show, and your brain has no access to that prefrontal cortex, that filter in your brain. That you've got to, through therapy, through information, through EMDR and different things, you've got to try to provide the bypass. So we'll be talking more about that. Hope this helps. We'll talk to you again soon. God bless.